Why is the case of Julian Assange important for Americans and people all over the world?
Well, Julian Assange performed a major service. He has found ways to gain access to materials that the population should definitely know about, and he's released them to the public. An effort, for this he's already been very severely punished. He was under very punitive house arrest for years, sequestered in the Ecuadorian embassy. They kicked him out. He's been placed in a high security prison. His life is in danger from the treatment he's received, and he's now facing the threat of very severe punishment by the U.S. government for the services that he's performed for the public. A matter of extreme importance for those who care about the brutal and unfair treatment of someone, and also who care about the right of citizens to gain access to knowledge about what their elected representatives are doing.
For people who perhaps may be uninitiated, what was Julian Assange's crime?
Julian Assange's primary crime was releasing to the public material that the government did not want the public to know. So, for example, the Trump administration presumably was quite happy about his releasing information that harmed their political opponent. They're not calling for extradition for that. They're calling for extradition because he released material like the truths about what was happening in the Iraq War, or other materials, which incidentally are widely used by journalists and scholars and are available to the public, but power systems do not like what they're doing to be revealed.
Can you make a comparison between what Daniel Ellsberg did and yourself during the Pentagon Papers era and today with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks?
Daniel Ellsberg very courageously undertook actions that were illegal and could have put him in jail for life, releasing to the general public material about what the government had been doing in its huge war in Indochina. Ellsberg did not release the one volume of the Pentagon Papers which dealt with ongoing affairs, negotiations. He felt that that should not be released, but he did release things about what had happened in the past, which were being concealed for absolutely no legitimate reason. And again, materials that are widely used by scholars, journalists, general public who want to have some understanding of what their government was doing for, in this case, 30 years, 20 years. Assange, in contrast, is doing something perfectly legitimate. There should be absolutely no constraint, no penalty. It's like a journalist who carries out an investigative journalism and reveals to the public what he discovered.
The critique of Assange from the left is that he enabled Trump to become president, and there's been a lot of animosity about that. Could you frame that and explain why you believe that's not the case?
There are people on what's called the left, in fact mostly the center, who are resentful of the fact that Assange released information that harmed the Clinton candidacy. They can have their opinions, but that has absolutely nothing to do with the charges again, with the case and its nature. If you don't like what he did, you can write an article saying, yeah, I don't like what he did. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the effort the fact of punishing him for many years, long before the Clinton Trump campaign and seeking to extradite him today for severe punishment. If you don't like what he did, say so. That's your right to do so.
Now, you've had personal contact with Julian.
My wife, Valeria, and I did visit him in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he was under extremely dire conditions. The embassy is a room. He had a room, in fact, to which he was confined. He couldn't go outdoors. In many ways, it's worse than being in a prison. A prisoner is allowed outdoors once in a while, allowed to get some exercise. But he endured it. As far as his vision was concerned, I can't speak for him. I can only discuss what he did, namely reveal extremely important information. A lot of insight into policy from the things that he revealed. So just kind of to pick one at random, which didn't become famous. He managed to gain access to a Pentagon document in which the Pentagon listed sites internationally that are of enormous strategic importance and have to be protected kind of, at all costs.
What is it about the current situation with Julian right now, where he's facing extradition from the UK to the United States coming up in February? Could you frame that?
Assange's current situation, according to the few people who've been able to see him, is severe deterioration, physical, cognitive, the result of extremely harsh, brutal punishment. And in fact, people have seen him say his life may be in danger from these harsh, brutal conditions. His crime, technically, is not paying bail. Okay, so you pay $50, maybe you spend a night in jail. For this crime, he's been placed in a high-security prison. This is after all he's endured already, and treated like one of the world's dangerous terrorists, and meanwhile facing the constant threat of extradition to the United States, which can take savage retribution for what was in fact a service to the citizens of the United States. That's a brutal situation to try to endure.
Could you speak to, once again, the point about this being a freedom of the press issue?
Well, the concept of journalism and publishing has taken a more expansive form in the digital age. So there are publishers who don't put out a single hard copy page. They do everything digitally. There are journalists who do their work and post the results. This is a case of a person who falls within the category of journalism and publisher in the modern sense, and is being not only silenced but bitterly punished for carrying out what ought to be the function of journalists and publishers in a free society. And in fact, as I said, journalism and scholarship uses his material constantly. So the effort to silence him reminds me of Mussolini's dictatorship. The great journalist, left activist Antonio Gramsci was sentenced to decades in prison under Mussolini's fascist dictatorship, and the prosecutor at the time of the trial said, we have to make sure this voice is silenced, and the way to silence him, put him in prison. Assange faces that, and possibly even worse. If the notion of freedom of press means anything, this is a textbook example of an effort to undermine it.
What do you feel is at stake in this case right now for democracy in the United States?
Well, what is at stake, first of all, and we should not forget this, is the life of a person who carried out the duties of a concerned citizen, an honest journalist. That's one. For democracy, it means the same as it meant in Italy when Gramsci was sentenced on the grounds that this voice has to be silenced.
Do you feel that Russian interests manipulated Julian? Do you have a sense for that?
You know, it's possible that the Russians tried to do something to influence the election. Actually, the National Academy did a study of this. They couldn't find any detectable effect. But the whole question is kind of a joke. If you want to look at interference in U.S. elections, it's right in front of your eyes. The interference in U.S. elections by private wealth and corporate power is simply overwhelming. Academic political science has demonstrated very persuasively that you can predict the outcome of an election with very high confidence simply by looking at the simple variable of campaign spending. Political scientist Thomas Ferguson and his colleagues have done extensive work on this, and there's other work showing that as a result of this, a large part of the population is simply disenfranchised. The roughly lower three-quarters, roughly, of the population on the income scale are literally unrepresented, and that there's no correlation between their opinions and the voting record of their own representatives who listen to other voices. You're elected to Congress, you may spend 5 hours a day talking to rich donors to try to make it to the next election. Now, that's apart from the overwhelming influence of lobbyists, grown enormously since the Reagan years, since the Nixon years actually, which means that congressional offices are deluged with high-paid corporate lawyers and others who overwhelm the staff while the congressperson himself, representatives, may be on the phone to some donor, and they're writing the legislation which that person then signs. I mean, interference with U.S. elections is massive domestically. In comparison, whatever Russia might have done is like a straw in a haystack. Quite apart from that, does the U.S. interfere in elections? I mean, to the extent of overthrowing governments if we don't like them. It's kind of serious interference, and it goes all the way down from that, including Russian elections. The 1996 Russian election, Clinton not only interfered enough to get his candidate elected, but was very proud of it. It wasn't hidden, nor is it overhidden when we overthrow other governments. I mean, it's hard even to talk about this topic. It's so meaningless.
What will it look like if Assange is extradited to the United States? Do you have an idea of how that will roll out in this superheated partisan environment?
I hate to predict as things now stand, but we can say what ought to be done. There ought to be a massive popular protest against any thought of trying him for anything, let alone the charges for which he's facing. And if that could be developed to sufficient extent, it might be enough to reverse this absurd and basically criminal effort.
What does it say Julian, on one hand, will be essentially shredded by the Trump administration, while at the same time we're facing the situation with Zelensky and the phone call that has created this entire impeachment process?
There are a number of elements to this. For one thing, we should remember that it's not a Trump invention. His predecessor, Obama, broke all records in trying to silence whistleblowers, way more than all preceding administrations combined. Trump is carrying it forward. And the case in question is quite intriguing when you look at it. Trump has carried out major crimes, huge crimes, some of the worst in human history. I mean, his policies on global warming alone may doom the species to virtual extinction. His policies in the military domain are outrageous, dismantling the last vestiges of the arms control regime, which he's been doing. It poses an enormous threat to survival, and we could go on. There's major crimes. What is he being charged with? Take a look at it. He's being charged with harming a leading figure in the Democratic Party, in Joseph Biden, in his potential campaign. Well, maybe what he did was illegal. Good, probably is one of many illegal acts. But that's the charge. Incidentally, does that remind you of something? There was an affair called Watergate. Richard Nixon was guilty of enormous crimes, like the bombing of Cambodia, for example. There were people in Congress who tried to put that on the bill, things like that on the bill of the indictment. The Jesuit priest Robert Trinan from Massachusetts was one. They were all knocked off. The crime that was left, the prime crime that was left, was breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters. Does that suggest something? That what it suggests is that people in power, roughly half the power in the country, know how to protect themselves.
What is your hope for Julian Assange?
Hope? My hope is that the British government has the integrity to release him from prison and put aside any further requests for extradition. My second hope is that the population of the United States will understand what's happening, rise up, and prevent the administration from calling for extradition.
We're looking at a political prosecution.
This is plainly a political prosecution. As I said, he's not being charged by the Trump administration with releasing information that harmed Hillary Clinton. In fact, they openly cheered that. So he's not being charged with that. He's being charged with releasing information that the government doesn't want the population to see. Is that a political? How could you have a clearer criterion of what's a political crime at a rather trivial level, in fact, when you see what's involved? But putting all that aside, it just doesn't matter. If the extradition treaty said to the British government, do whatever you're told by the White House, it would still be improper. It's independent of the technical legalities of the extradition treaty.
Moving forward, if Julian Assange's demise here, either physical or political, or him being imprisoned at some point again for the rest of his life, what does that tell us for the future in this era of Trump and malfeasance and criminality?
It tells us what it would have told us if Dan Ellsberg's trial had gone through to completion. Remember, he was on trial for probably a life sentence, and the trial happened to be stopped by another Nixon crime. What happened was that Nixon tried to bribe the judge, and the judge therefore called a mistrial. Otherwise, Ellsberg would probably be in jail. And what would that tell us? It tells us we live in a very repressive society with an authoritarian streak in which the government has the power to prevent the population from knowing things that the government doesn't like. This would be the same.
Just a quick message that you would want to communicate to interested parties who are analyzing this case.
The main thing is that the technicalities really don't matter. I mean, the basic issue is clear and simple. Here is somebody who undertook to release to the general public information that the public should know. And he has already been very harshly punished for that. He is now at this moment being punished in the conditions of the high security system. He's being threatened with much worse The message to the public is this should not be tolerated, should be ended at once, independent of any technicalities of law that some lawyer might pick up.